Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to honor my friend Kamal Bawa. I've known him for many, many years. I never miss an opportunity to come to India. As I've told many people, my first day ever in the tropics was in India. It's always good to be back. We have had some really serious technical problems with this presentation. I will do my best, including figuring out how to advance the slide. That doesn't work. Yes, it does. I want to ask 3 questions. How many species are going extinct? What are we doing to protect them? And how can we do better? One way. So, if you listen to Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth, if you listen to the International Policy Science Forum on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, after which I need to take a deep breath, or this wonderful demonstrator in the streets of London, you will know that species are going extinct 1,000 times faster than they should be. And the reason that my colleagues and I came up with that estimate is we don't know how many species there are. We can calculate species extinction rates, but we really have no idea how many kinds of species there are. There are guesses, and they are just that. We can calculate extinction rate as if it's a death rate. We know what the global death rate of people is. It's about 8 people per 1,000 per year. And if you do the calculation, it means it's very unlikely you will die during my seminar. But we also understand there are times in our history when death rates are many, many times higher than that. And so we can calculate how fast species are going, how fast they're dying off. And those numbers come out to be numbers that are on the order of 100 or a few hundred extinctions per million species per year. Now, we have already seen in the talk so far something about the birth rates of species. We can look at molecular phylogenies and we can discover how fast species are being born. And we know what those birth rates are. And it's a comparison of these death rates with those birth rates that give us that number that we're driving species to extinction 1,000 times faster than they should go normally. There's something else. If we look at the death rates of species that were described in the 19th century, they are much lower than the death rates of species described in the 20th century. And the reason for that is the species that we described in the 20th century, particularly in the last half of the 20th century, are rare. And because they're rare, they're more vulnerable. Now, what that means is if we're going to understand biodiversity and the threats to it, we need to have an energetic program of discovering species, working out their taxonomy, and mapping where they are. And that, of course, is a huge contribution of ATREE. ATREE has been the leader in mapping out India's biodiversity, working out what we have, what's there, what the species are. And we must not underestimate that contribution, because without it, we cannot understand how seriously we are affecting the world's biodiversity. So, how are we doing to protect species? This is going to be a key question when the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity meet in Kunming later this year. There are going to be all sorts of people talking about, are we going to protect 30% of the planet or 50% of the planet? I find those kinds of discussions to be entirely self-serving. I think they're grandstanding. Some countries are going to find it very easy to protect more of their land. India is going to find it very difficult to protect more than it has. The questions are, can we do it more efficiently? Or what can we do? What's practical? And I think we should have that kind of discussion. What kinds of achievements can we make? What kind of policies can we set when we meet in Kunming? If we look at where the world's protected areas are, shown in green, they are broadly in the areas shown in yellow. These are the wild places. These are the places where there are very, very few people. And not surprisingly, we as a global community have tended to put protected areas in remote places where there are no people. One of the largest national parks in the world, maybe even the largest. I have actually been there. Well, I've flown over it. It's the top end of Greenland. I have no intention of going to the top end of Greenland. It's far too cold for a tropical biologist like me. But asking for more area, asking for 30% or 50%, isn't going to make a lot of difference for biodiversity if we put it in the wrong place and we put it in places where there are no people. China can achieve 30% easily just by putting a protected area in the middle of the Gobi Desert. I have nothing against the Gobi Desert, but that's not where China's biodiversity is, and it's not where India's biodiversity is. So let's have a look at this diagram. We have protected 13% of the ice-free land surface. Let's take the 50% of the land that's wilderness. What should we expect in terms of protecting species ranges? For a species that has a large geographical range, by chance alone, you'd expect 13% of it to be predicted, 50% of it to be in wilderness, just by putting a large range down at random. If we have a small range species, this is such a rare set of species, you probably have never seen unicorns in the wild, but if we have a whole bunch of unicorn species, by chance alone, 13% of the unicorns will be protected, 50% of them will be in wilderness. So it doesn't matter how big a range you are, you still have this expectation. So what have we achieved? If you take species globally around the world and ask what fractions of their ranges are protected, for species with big ranges, it's about what you expect. Big range species like this trickle deer, 13% of their range are protected, 50% tends to be in remote places. That's what you'd expect. It more or less has to be that way. But the critical question is, how are we doing to protect species with small ranges, because those are the species that are much more vulnerable. And the remarkable thing globally is we, the conservation community, we, the park services, the fish and wildlife services, the various wildlife agencies around the world are protecting species with small geographical ranges very much better than we expect. We're doing a good job. I don't think people have quite understood that yet. We are creating large national parks, but we're also putting small national parks in the right places. And what we must do in Kunming is ask for more than that. This is a global analysis. Have we done this for India? The answer is no, but not yet. And with Indian colleagues, I expect to have the answer in time for the edited volume that I believe we're going to produce. So how can we do better? To do better, we need to know where species are. Now, this is where things can go terribly wrong. Can I have this video, please? We can map out the distribution of many species now in considerable detail. These are birds, and they show that the warm, wet tropics are where most of the species are. Mammals show a broadly similar pattern. These are the places with the greatest concentration of species, and it's likely to be true for most species. Amphibians, for example, show a similar pattern, and while we have less detailed data for plants, it's almost certainly true for them too. But just looking at species is not sufficient. We need to dig deeper. Let's look again at the distribution of bird species. In the Amazon, there are the greatest numbers of species. But if we look at where species have smaller than the median range size, those distributions are profoundly different. They concentrate in Central America and in the northern Andes, and in places like the coastal forests of Brazil. That's important because species with small ranges are much more vulnerable to extinction than species with large ranges. Okay, now can I go back to the slides? Thank you. So, one of the things that we need to do is to produce what I call strategic maps, to map out biodiversity on a large scale and look at where species with small ranges are concentrated. By small range, I mean less than the median. And parts of this will be very familiar to you. The Western Ghats, fancy that, has a concentration of small range species. These are birds. I'm not sure I'm going to show the mammals, but the mammals look pretty much the same. Plants look pretty much the same. Look at the northeast of India. Now, I think the interesting thing about the northeast is we have to be international in how we think about our biodiversity priorities. The key biodiversity hotspot, because after all, this is just a sophisticated version of the late Norman Mailer's ideas. That biodiversity hotspot is shared with Nepal and Bhutan. It's shared with China. I work a lot in China. China thinks that Arunachal Pradesh belongs to them, which creates all sorts of interesting problems when you ask the Chinese why they're not protecting it properly, and definitely parts of China that really do belong to China. This is a complicated area, and it's one that we have to think of as a unified area for protecting biodiversity. Mammals, in this case I've plotted the threatened species. Threatened species and small range species go hand in hand. So the northeast, for both birds and mammals and the Ghats, represent broad regions that we need to address. But we need to go from these broad strategic maps to tactical maps, maps that we can use to set practical conservation priorities. And to do that, we have to take these broad ranges of species and begin to think, what do those ranges really look like? What happens when we recognize that species have elevational limits and they only occur in forest? For this particular bird, its IUCN range, its official range is 41,000 square kilometers. It's only got about 7,000 kilometers of actual habitat. If we start to layer those maps on top of each other, we can go from general strategic maps by trimming those by elevation, by looking at where the forest cover is, looking at where the species richness is in detail. And so for this area of northeastern India, northern Myanmar and China, we begin to get a much more richly textured map that allows us to think about whether our protected areas are in the right place. Yes, we're doing a great job at Eagle Nest. It's a remote area, there's a lot of forest. But how well are we doing in these very poorly known tribal areas on the border between India, China, Myanmar? Those are areas that require some sophistication if we're going to manage them well. As an example, not from India, this is what we call a tactical map from coastal Brazil. The mountains of coastal Brazil, in many ways, are broadly similar to the Western Ghats. It's a long strip of coastal mountains. when we begin to map out species against elevation, we often find that the species that we have fragmented distributions. And we know from lots of studies, including those done by Tom Lovejoy in the Amazon, that species disappear from fragmented landscapes quickly. And I think this is where the computer, oh no, it's working. It's a miracle. No, it's not. It's working here, but it's not working there. I'm afraid if I'll crash the system if I press it again. So what this is going to show, well, it isn't going to show apparently, but this is a fragmented landscape. My group, Saving Nature, decided that the way to effect practical conservation interactions was to go in there and restore that forest. Nothing happens. All right, I'm at the end of my talk anyway. The slide that I can't show you is of 2018, and in 2018, all of this area is forested. So let me bring these three ideas together. We're losing species 1,000 times faster than we should. To know more about what we're losing, we need to have considerable better taxonomy. We need to have data on distributions. We need to have more of the very, very important biodiversity surveys that ATREE has been leading. When we see species and think about how they're protected, there are global efforts to say we need 30% or 17% or 50%. I think that's the wrong kind of number. We need to be asking for India, what fractions of species are we protecting, and particularly those species that are more vulnerable. That's an analysis which we can do and we must do. And the final part of this is to begin to look at landscapes in detail. We will often find that those landscapes are fragmented. We've left forest, but we've left forest in pieces. And when that happens, it's well within our technical capacity to change that fragmented landscape to the slide that you can't see, which is a connected landscape, and so reduce the extinction rates. Thank you very much.